Welcome, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Lessons from the Cockpit. I'm your host, Mark Hasara. I'm a former KC-135 pilot and an instructor at the Air Force's Weapons School, where I helped create the KC-135 division at Fairchild Air Force Base. I authored the book Tanker Pilot, available in all 4 formats on Amazon. Myself and 2 of my friends also created Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar, which is the sponsor of this episode. Our ready-to-print and custom aviation artwork can be found at wallpilot.com. My lifelong passion has been airplanes and aviation. Since I was a 4-year-old kid standing on the hood of Grandpa Andy's car, watching Boeing 707s and DC-8s Lockheed Electras fly over my head, landing at Los Angeles International Airport, I have been in love with all things airplane and aviation. That's when I said to myself, why work for a living when I can do this? And for over 60 years now, I have been associated with airplanes and aviation. Ask any pilot to define flying for you, and they're probably going to tell you long periods of boredom interrupted by short intermittent periods of extreme terror. On the Lessons from the Cockpit show, we debrief some of the most fascinating and intriguing pilots, weapon system operators, maintainers, and aviation enthusiasts from all over the world. Our show investigates the tactics, techniques, and procedures that these aviators created or cultivated during those extreme and extraordinary military, commercial, and private flying operations. This exploration gives our listeners practical advice on how the aviation world works and helps develop critical thinking skills and expertise in the air and on the ground. Many of these techniques and procedures are being revealed and told about here for the very first time. On today's show, you're going to hear what it takes to build a new fighter jet and the process you have to go through in order to create an airplane like the F-22, probably the best fighter plane in the world because of the systems that it has on that airplane. You're also going to hear how age and treachery will always overcome youth and exuberance in Mike's encounter with a Russian bear bomber. So, let's get started. Grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's launch the Lessons from the Cockpit show. All right, we were talking about F-22 program.
The F-22 program. This was probably one of the most seminal times in my life. It was only about a 7.5 year period, but it was my first position outside of the U.S. military. And it was just timing. I happened to have the right background that they were looking for. I was an engineer with a fighter background. It didn't take long for Lockheed Martin to snap me up. For me to be on a program that was once a black program that just now won the contract, it was still classified, but it was not clandestinely so. In other words, you could talk about it. You just couldn't tell you a lot of things about it at the time.
So did you have a prototype at this time period? Did they have anything, or is it still on paper?
No, actually, it started way back in 1985 as a black program, and it ended up distilling itself down to two sets of prototypes, four total airplanes, of which Northrop Grumman and McDonnell Douglas were teamed with their prototype, which was the YF-23.
Yeah.
Lockheed Martin and a team of 3 corporate giants, which was really Lockheed Aerospace at the time, General Dynamics Aerospace, and of course Boeing Military Aerospace.
Yeah.
As one team. The motors were a separate contract altogether, but they were also flying off with Pratt & Whitney and General Electric, trying to decide who was going to be the engine of choice for whoever won.
Yeah.
So they had to make 4 sets of motors, 1 each for each prototype.
Yeah.
That way you could get a fair evaluation of what was the best configuration to go forward. In the end, Lockheed had won the competition, and that means Lockheed's preliminary subcontractors, which was General Dynamics and Boeing, also won, and they were going to split the profits 3 ways.
Yeah.
Now, everybody that was part of their subcontractors also won, because after that, there wasn't a lot of money going around, and the significance of winning that in 1990 was that it completely redefined what the prominence was going to be in the aerospace engineering field, certainly in the United States and also around the world. As you can see, what happens next is, because there weren't a lot of other contracts to go around, because the money was all going to go towards developing the F-22 program, then a $20 billion program for development. That meant that everybody else had to either sink or swim or consolidate. And so you saw companies that were overextended get bought out by other companies. Boeing bought out McDonnell Douglas.
Yep.
You had companies like Litton getting bought out by Lockheed Martin, and Martin Marietta and Lockheed merged. A lot of things happened. Boeing bought out Rockwell. There was a whole series of what used to be big companies that literally had to consolidate. I think the survivors probably were Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, who literally came out of the aircraft industry as a drone supplier and then worked their way back into it, and probably Raytheon. Other than that, everybody else got sucked up into one of those companies. So it was a huge turmoil that were decided by one program contract win, which was the F-22 program, and a reordering of the entire aerospace defense industry at the time. A huge seminal moment really for engineering in that world. So Lockheed now in a position where it had to start ramping up really fast. And I got sucked up into Lockheed's operations, Marietta, Georgia, which is now where the program was going to start its EMD program. Now, that itself was a job where you now had to learn real fast. You may have been an engineer, but you've never been in engineering management. And tying together the number one program at the time, aerospace defense program at the time, from scratch into a superior weapon system that had never been there before was something to behold. And it took a lot of expertise, all the companies really, and the engineers to make that happen. And so what Lockheed did, certainly Lockheed did not have all the engineers to do that. So we drew from a lot of the teams that did not make it. We got a lot of our engineers from Northrop Grumman. We got a lot of our engineers from Donald Douglas. Mm-hmm. We picked up quite a few from college, but mostly the experience came from companies that had already done this kind of work. It's just now we had a different program and a whole different set of requirements. And it was no longer just a matter of putting an airplane together that was like the other ones before, only faster or more maneuverable. This one now incorporated aspects that had never been incorporated before in a fighter. Predominantly stealth, supercruise, and one other thing, sensor track fusion, which was the integration of sensor data and other facets into a massive computer and series of softwares that had to all work together to make this airplane more than just a lethal fighter in the air, but actually a battle management platform that had capabilities that rivaled an AWACS, airborne warning and control aircraft, mm-hmm. as well as the ability to talk with the rest of the players in the air order battle in a way that cannot be compromised by the enemy. Then you got to make it fly well past the speed, twice the speed of sound, and turn on a dime. So to make all that happen, think of taking an aircraft and making its drag profile significantly less than the F-15 was, mm-hmm. and go at least as fast, if not significantly faster than the F-15, and turn tighter than the F-15 and or F-16. At the same time, nobody can see you. So effectively...
But you can see them.
Oh, more than you can see them in 3 dimensions. And that is the fundamental difference. If you look at the old F-4 and you look at the F-15, you literally can see 60 degrees, mm-hmm. 60 degrees either side of the center line of the nose of the airplane, and 60 degrees high and low. I mean, rough numbers.
Yeah.
F-15 was no different. It was a little bit stronger radar, had better software. It could do track while scan, whereas the F-4 couldn't do it. F-16 started out as a day point defense fighter. Mm-hmm. It grew into something that had a better radar capability. Mm-hmm. Still not like the F-15. The F-22 was light years above that. Instead of using a radar as a primary sensor, it was just one of many sensors and pieces of gathering information. And I have to be careful here about what I'm going to talk about. All that goes into, instead of a display, all that goes into a computer that marries up that information and then draws a picture for you that's not 2-dimensional, but 3-dimensional. It can tell you now what's above you, what's below you, what's behind you, not just what's in front of you. And that was fundamentally different because now you're basically a battle manager, not just a stick and rudder guy. So
and
you had to
totally see your airspace around you.
Absolutely.
For miles.
More than just your airspace, you can see who's friend and foe. You can see what directions they're going. You can see what altitudes they're at, what speeds they're coming at. and some other information too that you might be able to get from other sources. And so the bottom line here is now you've got that fused together into a battle space that you can control before you even get to the merge of the fight. And so you've already been able to move. Now, at the same time, you've got the speed via your less drag profile, plus the much better, much more efficient motors, where you can literally super cruise, which is to say that you can fly at supersonic speeds without going into afterburner. You're now cruising around at a throttle position that and speeds that the F4 would be literally impossible to maintain without running out of gas.
Yeah.
So you can move. What does that mean? That means if I'm trying to patrol an area the size of Iraq, I can go from one side to the other fairly quickly without burning up a lot of gas. Whereas the F4 probably would get about halfway down that distance. It's time to go home or hit a tanker.
Yeah.
That means a whole lot because you now can move from one part of the battlefield in the air to another in order to intercept or engage somebody that could be untouchable before because you just couldn't get there that fast. Not to mention that you could see him and react to him better, which means you can position yourself to be much more in an advantage during the initial engagement. And if you did engage, the aircraft could actually turn tighter than a human can stand. So the limiting factor now became the pilot, not the airplane. And so there were a lot of things about the capabilities of the F-22, and some that certainly we're not at liberty to talk about, that made it far superior to anything the enemy had at that time. And even today, some over 15, 17 years after it went
public,
after it went operational, it's still an aircraft that is far more superior than what the Russians or the Chinese have. And believe me, they're trying their darndest, trying to be as good or better than the F-22, and they're coming out with a J-20, for instance. Or you've got what started out with the Su-30MK. The Su-30MKs were good airplane and offshoots of Su-27s, but you've got now the Su-57s, which is an excellent airplane in its own right, but still not at the level of the F-22.
Yeah.
First of all, just the stealth alone and the operational ability to field stealth like that and maintain it is going to be difficult for them to do. And secondly, they have to be able to not only defeat the F-22's radar, but every other radar out there working with the F-22 to be able to hide from what's going to be inevitably a lethal engagement. And that just begins the issue. So all that had to go together, and of course that now meant that Lockheed had to heavily get engaged in a new arena of engineering, and that's software engineering. In its infant stages, really at that stage. Yes, they had done software engineering before, but not to the level we're talking about. We're talking about writing software that did more than just manage the airplane. You had navigation software, you had tactical software, we had an incredible amount of diagnostic software that allowed you the capability to work with the aircraft. The software had to be redundant and survivable, which is to say, when you started if you got shot up, it would steadily degrade your aircraft capabilities without shutting everything down. And things of that nature that were necessary to be able to incorporate that, which means it had to be designed. And of course, you've got three companies now that did things three different ways that had to be tied together in one cohesive fashion, not to include all of their suppliers, which all had to do it a certain way. So the systems engineering management corporate aspects of the program were huge. Not just the United States, but some of our foreign partners like GEC Marconi, some of the French companies that were making. Heck, we had the French. Michelin was making the tires at the time. They had titanium bands. I mean, there was a lot of technology that went into the F-22, even simple things that were new, groundbreaking. At one point between PDR and CDR, we calculated during that year that we literally had to invent something new somewhere in the program every day that had never existed before, just to keep up with the development of that program schedule.
Tell people what PDR and CDR is.
PDR stands for Preliminary Design Review.
And why that's important.
And CDR stands for Critical Design Review. The normal standard progression for a major systems engineering program, which is what most of our weapon systems go through, is based on a MIL standard called, basically MIL standard 1521, for whatever that's worth, that had to do with the progression of program from one design review to the next. It always started with, what are your requirements? Do you know what those are? That was Systems Requirements Review, or SRR. And then you move from that, not just at the top level, but all the way down through the different subsystems to make sure that everybody knows how they fit into the larger picture. And then each one successfully moves through a series of preliminary designs all the way up to the overall aircraft weapon system, which incorporates all of it together, and it has to match. And so as you go through the preliminary designs, you fix things through a set of allocated design requirements that make up the preliminary design of what the aircraft's going to be. From there, you'll refine that between preliminary design review to critical design review. And critical design review is a final review at each successive level that finalizes that part of the aircraft until you get to the top, which is where all of it now becomes what we call the freeze point, or the design that you're going to actually go build and test for the rest of the program. And so those three design reviews are critical in any major complex program, and that still stands today. It's been that way for at least the last 70 years, since the 1950s. To some degree, there's been variations of this using agile tools and agile processes, but it still really comes down to, you have to know what your requirements are. You're allotted a certain amount of that to allocate to what your lower level requirements and your preliminary design is going to be for both hardware, software, and your interfaces. And then, of course, you go from there to a more refined and critical design, which is essentially the design you're going to freeze, build, and test. Now, that's in a perfect world. It rarely happens like that.
Yeah.
When you're doing something like this, it's only a matter of time before you find something that you can't do, doesn't fit, or it's going to be a major expense to make it happen. And especially when you get into software. And in the case of the F-22, software was a huge issue that had to be done not only at the supplier levels for their parts of it, but integrating the whole system. Because the F-22 contract, unlike most, involved three major areas. One was the air vehicle and everything it entails, but the other two areas had to do with integrated training systems, simulators, software, course curriculum, facilities, that sort of things, and how that was going to be implemented on the program. And the third thing had to do with, what about post-delivery support, your support program? Was that going to be a PBL contract? Was that going to what are your sources? Where are your logistics operations going to be? Your maintenance? What are the maintenance programs? What are the maintenance training?
How are we going to fix it? Where do the parts come from?
And what are the manuals that say what we're going to do? Well, Tech Pubs is a huge thing that people overlook. The other thing too is that the support program included the off-board diagnostic systems that tapped into your onboard diagnostic systems to see what is the health of the airplane. Is it broke? What's broke? What do I need to pull? You can't just start ripping things through. That's a pretty expensive way to go fix an airplane. You want to know beforehand what's broken, so you can move that part, replace it, and then go fix the other part in a two-level operational maintenance system. Okay, so that was all relatively new, and it was going to be an all-integrated process, and it became the paradigm by which most of the programs that had highly advanced technological weapon systems they followed that paradigm, and followed that paradigm to some degree even today. And so the F-22 was groundbreaking on many levels. And that's what made it so unique. And of course, to learn all that was a big glass of water you had to swallow. And you had to do it pretty fast, too. If you're gonna join a company like Lockheed on a new program like that, very steep learning curve. Between SRR and CDR was a couple of years of 14-hour days by a lot of thousands of people just grinding it out. I was very proud of it because at the time, it's hard to have a program like that and not have overruns. And at the time, F-22, by the time I got to CDR, F-22 was within a couple of weeks of its stated initial program plan, and it was about 10% over budget. So our EAC was about 10%. EAC standing for estimated completion. Okay, now, at the time, everybody was screaming about the fact that you had an overrun, but put that in perspective. By the time the F-35 program, which followed it, which is not a $20 billion program, it was a $200 billion program. By the time they reached CDR, they were easily 50 to 60% EAC overrun, which is to say that, and of course, subsequently, as we know, it eventually became 100% overrun. So that $200 billion development program now became a $400 billion development program. What the F-22 was doing, pretty efficient by comparison. And they were groundbreaking. Now, you could say that the F-22 was making 3 airplanes. And to a large degree it was, but there were 3 airplanes based on a common platform. Okay, and the B model was the one that was most significant. The other 2 really didn't change that much. I mean, they had a different wing and different flight control laws, but you weren't really designing a completely separate airplane with completely separate maintenance systems or training systems. I don't buy that. I think there was a lot of mistakes made on the F-35 that the F-22 had been able to resolve early on. And that really dealt a lot with the systems engineering management parts of the program.
And it sounds like they didn't learn their lesson.
Well, you get
because
different...
I mean, you guys had a program that was only, what'd you say, 10% EAC. I mean, that's really good if you think about programs now, okay, particularly the 767, F-35. Why didn't they learn that with the F-35?
Well, different people. I mean, let's face it, you go through a generation of engineers after 10, 15 years. And different people take over. And if you weren't on one program and you now have picking up another program, you still have skilled people, but they've not necessarily been in a major program like that. And so you have some skill sets. I mean, you had some of the leaders were on the program, but they may have not been directly involved in some of the decisions that the early ones made. And most of those leaders in the F-22 program by that time had retired. Okay. And not to mention the fact that you had 2 different parts of Lockheed Martin Aero. Even though it was the same company, the Marietta team was different than the Fort Worth team. And so it was like 2 different divisions, even though they were still part of the Lockheed Martin sector for the aerospace.
Isn't that interesting, man? Different cultures at different buildings in the same company.
Different cultures at different locations within the same company. You do have a cross flow of engineers. In my case, at the right levels, it was not enough. They took a lot of technology across, and they developed their own technology, which was even more significant over time in the F-35, but the F-22 was the baseline for much of that. And you can see that in the design of the aircraft.
Yeah.
I mean, they look a lot. The reason the front end of that looks a lot alike, systems look a lot alike, is because it was taken from the F-22 program. The F-22 initial support program was different than the ALICE system used right now for the F-35 because I think they backed that back in.
Yeah.
But even the ALICE system that was developed for the F-35 has not met the standard that they expected it to meet because it was completely new. I think they're still working, as of this date, the bugs out of that. And that's caused a lot of problems. Caused a lot of problems on the F-22 program with shortages of parts and the inability to fix the RCS coatings in a timely manner that they would have hoped to expect for various reasons. So those examples where you've had growing pains or parts of the program that have not been able to get up to speed like they should have. Not from my perspective, not from my ability to see it from where I am. There's a lot of smart guys there. I've got faith in those guys, being a Lockheed Martin guy. Even though I am retired now, that they will be able to eventually fix it. The question is, how much is it going to cost to do that? At this point, it pains me to watch an airplane with the capability that the Raptor has now being put on sunset list by the current administration, because although people say, well, we got something better in the works, I said, well, when is that going to happen? Because it takes sometimes 10 to 15 years to get an airplane that's in a prototype stage into an operational stage, especially with the capabilities that are being demanded of these airplanes by the U.S. military for future wars. And believe me, there will be a future war. It's only a matter of when.
And there's not that many of them.
Well, right now there's only 187 that are operational, and that's just the total numbers. We're not talking about the ones that are down for maintenance, the ones that are in PDM, the ones that are going through, there's even less at any one time. The F-35s are ramping up, but the F-35 is going to be an outstanding attack airplane. It's not an air-to-air dogfighter, but it was never meant to be in its defense. It was never, from the very beginning of its inception, it was never meant to be an F-22. They were meant to complement each other, much like the F-16 and 15, what we call the high and low mix.
Mm-hmm.
We now have two airplanes that can complement each other and become a force multiplier by the way they interact, their data link capabilities. However, you're about to lose one of them. And who are you going to replace it with if it's not the F-22? Right now, I'm having to go on hope that we actually do have something that's in the works that can get there in a timely manner. Because even if it does take 10 years to go from where it is right now, if it's there, to operationally production-ready aircraft, you still got to produce them. And you don't produce 2,000 airplanes in 1 year.
No.
Not without going to a major war footing.
No.
And we're not in a position right now to do that. Remember, to do that in World War II, we literally had to shut down all automobile manufacturing for 4 years. Okay?
Yeah.
We're not ready to do that.
Yeah. Packard took over Merlin engines, man.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
they were actually making engines instead of Packard cars.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. Ford was making tanks, trucks, airplanes.
Wildcats, version of the Wildcat.
Absolutely.
Crazy.
And so, are we in a position to do that right now? Nope. Absolutely not.
No, we're not.
And so let's say we have a problem in the Straits of Taiwan. Let's say hypothetically that Chairman Xi decides that this is the time to strike, the time to take advantage of a weak administration politically, or to take advantage of a political split within American society, that hopefully he can move in on Taiwan at the right moment and everybody will just not worry about it because they got bigger things to worry about in the States. Whatever the case may be, let's say it turns out that that's what he wants to do. Well, I guarantee you that the Navy can do a lot in the water, but not without command of the air. And so without air power, you don't have a lot going on the surface that's going to be real safe.
Yeah.
And so you better have something. Well, the only dominant fighter in the world today that outclasses literally every fighter in the world today is the United States, and that is the F-22 Raptor. And so that concerns me, and I'll freely admit there's a lot I don't probably know about what's being done in the classified world since I'm kind of out of that world now. Until I do know, I'm going to be concerned.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, we talked about earlier chasing the bear. Tell us about your chasing the bear.
Well, this actually takes me back to my days when I was at Osan. At Osan, of course, we did a lot of continuation training, and then every now and then we would sit alert and pull cap duty on the DMZ. Well, one day we were just going out on a continuation sortie, which normally amounted to practice air-to-air combat, dogfighting, if you will, or running intercepts for the Wizzos to get practice on techniques and some skill sets. And we were right over the eastern part of Korea, the south part of Korea Peninsula. Mind you, this is supposed to be just a training sortie. This was not a fragged sortie. And picked up traffic that was going at a fairly decent speed, paralleling pretty close to the shoreline. By saying pretty close, I'm saying it was probably around 10 miles offshore, not inside necessarily the territorial waters, but pretty good sized contact. And you could see it in a distance, just conning a little bit, and you can tell just from the pattern that was a Tu-95 Bear, okay, which is a Russian bomber. And these were notable bears. We intercepted them from time to time, so without authorization, decided we were going to go intercept that bear and wave to him, give him a low, and then head on back home. We didn't have a lot of gas to do that with, but we said, well, let's just go ahead and point our nose at him and start heading that way. Well, the bear recognized this immediately and immediately jinked a little bit to the right and started heading off away from the peninsula. And one thing about a bear, it may be a turboprop airplane, but it's got a lot of big turboprops. And
big propellers.
and that airplane can move pretty fast. that's not to say that F-4 couldn't catch it, because it could easily catch it, but when you get there, you may not have enough gas left to get back home, and that's the problem. And certainly we didn't have any tanker support since it was just a training sortie. And so I'm watching this thing move down my radar scope, manually tracking him. We're getting down to about 10 miles, 8 miles from this guy, but it's slowly moving. It's not moving real fast. And front seater says, "Hey, Mike, I think we're gonna have to start looking about going back home here." Okay, so I decided, what the heck, I'm going to lock this guy up with my radar. Now, locking somebody up is kind of an aggressive move. Okay. Now, we didn't have any missiles on the time. We had fake missiles. We had captive AIM-9s at the time.
But you are sending a message.
Well, that radar locks up. It looks the same on his screen. And, of course, the bomber is full of people with electronics knowledge and equipment. And I'm sure their version of the electronic warfare officer noticed that he was now tracked by an F-4. And tracking, what does that mean? That means I have locked him up, and my targeting computer is now positioning or trying to resolve a collision course solution for what would eventually be a missile shot. Now, that missile shot is only, at this point, when you're locked up, is only one button push away. And they know that, and we know that, even though you don't mean it that way, but he doesn't know you don't mean it that way. And he's not close enough to notice that you're just a training sortie. And so I'm sure that he probably got his hair up pretty quickly upon that. It probably wasn't the smartest thing for me to do, but I was a lieutenant at the time, brand new. Things like that just don't cross your mind.
When you're a lieutenant.
Yeah. So anyway,
age and treachery will always overcome youth and exuberance.
Absolutely. Stupidity matters. Anyway, so normally when you look at your radar screen, you get this thing called an aim dot. An aim dot gives you an indication of what direction he is going. And that aim dot tends to move slowly, because planes aren't just going to move around in the sky like flying saucers do. Okay, so it's going to move slowly regardless of what maneuver he does. But that's not what mine did. As soon as I locked him up, it waited about 10 seconds, and after that, my aim dot went from the left corner of my scope, immediately to the right corner of my scope, back down to the lower right corner of the scope, across back to the upper left-hand corner, and then back to the middle, and then the next thing I saw, my digital scope literally flashed and then went dead. So effectively what this guy had done, or his electronic warfare officer had done, was redirected my beam back to my aircraft and probably burned out my radar klystron. That's when I got a little bit of a lesson.
Take that, Lieutenant.
Note to self. You might be the loudest guy in the bar, but you are not the biggest fish in this sea. And so we headed on back. We limped back on home back to Osan with a broken radar, a very embarrassed Wizzo, trying to understand what the heck this guy just had done to my radar. So that was a big lesson to me, that if we're going to engage with these guys, I don't have all the answers, nor do I have all the weapons. And he has a few of his own that I didn't even know about. So we got back, and I had to explain to my crew chief why his radar no longer worked. And that was a humbling experience.
That's a lot of work, wasn't it?
Yeah. Hence, that's my first engagement with a Tu-95 Bear, and one I never forgot after that. If we ever had to go into a hot engagement with these guys, we certainly would be handling it a much different way.
Yeah.
Because what he essentially had done is shown me that he negated not only my radar, but my radar missiles at the same time. It's futile for me to engage him in that way. So
now you got to get close.
Well,
you got an F-4E that's got a gun.
Basically, my radar missiles, I know, which was my number one
priority missile.
Well, my number one weapon was useless against the bear bomber, and so yeah, I mean, you learn things like this very quick, and it was probably a lesson I'm glad I learned early. I certainly don't want to learn that when I'm going into war the very first day.
Oh yeah.
So anyway, that was my first engagement with a Badger or a Bear bomber, In fact, probably the only one I had when I was at Osan at the time. Most of the time, all the things I saw most of the time was just looking across the DMZ at MiG-19s or MiG-21s, circling there. Now, we did have times where we had other guys in our squadron were also engaging them. And let's face it, most of the time when we were intercepting bears or badgers, it was a pretty cordial affair, because they didn't want to get wrapped up and embroiled in a shooting war, and neither did we. And so a lot of times we spent a lot of time flying next to each other as an international way of communicating. They would have their tail guns up, would basically show that, hey, they're not a threat, and we would literally just do a wing over and show them that here we were showing them our weapons, and we'd fly off their wing at quite a distance, so that we were unthreatening, but we would wave at each other. Sometimes we got closer, but when we did, we certainly didn't tell our commanders that, because that was forbidden at the time. We just kind of kept it to ourselves. But that happened more often than not.
Yeah.
But it was an interesting affair. And I would say it's funny because the media and Hollywood paints us off as being warriors of both countries that want to do nothing but go to war with each other, when in fact, the last thing we want to do right now is start shooting at each other, because we're going to be the first to die. In the case, or at least, or at least be in a position to be the first to die. And I always found that dichotomy an interesting thing every time I saw movies that portrayed the military a certain way, when in fact I knew quite the opposite was the fact. Nobody really wants to do this, but if we had to do it, we were going to do it, and so would they. Yep. And so, again, you go back home and you grab a beer at the club, and you start waxing philosophically about what you just encountered and what lessons it's probably teaching you as you go forward. Yeah. So all in all, an interesting time for me.
Yeah. Now, you had another experience there, too, with Vice President Bush.
Cope Bush, actually. Yeah, when I was there in 1982, Vice President Bush, who, of course, this is George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush the elder, was vice president, of course, to President Reagan, and he'd come over on what was Air Force One, of course, when Reagan is in it. It's called Air Force One, and he brought Cap Weinberger, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, plus an entire entourage. And we knew that he was coming over, and so we were fragged as an operational escort. In fact, the whole squadron was fragged as an operational escort, and we set up a corridor of cap points so that they could come into Korea unharmed, unmolested, and certainly not being able to be targeted, at least not without us engaging anybody coming from the north or from the other avenues. And so they came in, we set up our cap points just like we normally did, and they flew through the cap, and then once he passed us, we basically recovered our aircraft back at Osan, landed, and parked the jets. Only instead of parking them in the normal points we were at, we parked them in a line where we got out, and we were asked to stand in front of our jets, much like you would see in Hollywood. We normally didn't do it that way, but hey, this was for show. And of course, our jets all had shark's teeth, which made it even more dramatic. So here now I have a line of shark's teeth clad F-4 Phantoms, and with two crews, and then behind them the maintenance crews for the jets. And up comes a black limousine with Cap Weinberger in it. So essentially, George Bush had gone up to Seoul with his entourage, and Cap Weinberger wanted to stay and look at the crews. And that was an honor for us, because this is the Secretary of Defense, and we're just a lowly squadron at Osan in the middle of Ford area, and we're basically at parade rest, in front of the jets, which was kind of cool, as long as we didn't have to do that forever. And Cap Weinberger pulls up, gets out of the car, and I'd never seen Cap Weinberger face to face. Most of us had not. And you always see him on television, and you see him from the shoulder up. And he looks bigger than life when he gives speeches, and so that's your impression of Cap Weinberger. The limousine door opens up, and out comes this short, very much roly-poly looking man with a smile on his face. And it turns out, you see the face, and you notice, now that's Cap Weinberger, but he looked like a giant basketball in a suit. and it was all we could do to kind of keep from smirking because he didn't look like this big guy you saw on television. But he was kind enough to shake our hands and thank us for all we did, and went down the whole receiving line, and then got back in his car, and they drove off to where I have no idea. But that was kind of an interesting thing as a crew member because you just normally don't see that. But this was part of the reason that I really liked being in the forward deployed locations, because things were far more exciting, and you got a chance to see things you didn't normally see in the continental United States.
And there was a reason for
Absolutely.
There was always a reason why.
Absolutely.
That's the one thing I remember about being at Kadena. There was a reason why we were going places with the RC-135s, and there was a reason why we were taking F-15s to the peninsula, and the exercises and so forth. There was always, and sometimes it was in the newspaper. A lot of times it wasn't.
Well, I can tell you that the 36th Squadron, the Flying Fiends, we were called, has been in Osan since 1950s. There they started out flying P-51s and then moved rapidly through different jets, ended up flying the F-86 Fs for the 51st Wing. Them and a few other squadrons, the 35th, the Pantons, and the 80th Juvats out at Kunsan, have been what we call guardians of the gate of that theater of operations since Korea. So they've been there a long time.
Long time.
Those squadrons have a history with that country.
Yeah.
And it's still there today. Now they're flying F-16s. And I can tell you right now, during the times during the Trump administration when Kim Jong-un was rattling sabers and threatening to do bad things with his missiles, I guarantee you the Fiends the current modern-day Fiends were probably very, very busy and very, very peaked as far as their sense of urgency. I'm sure that they were ready to go at a moment's notice because that is their job. They were effectively the tripwire. They were going to, just like we at the time, are going to be the ones that are going to have to literally hold off the horde for at least 2 or 3 days to give the CONUS units and the U.S. Navy and everything else a chance to move forward with supplies, with combat-ready units. And for that moment of time, I guarantee you they are going to be one busy squadron. And that includes the Juvats and the Pantons down at Kunsan. They'll be doing the same thing, as well as the squadrons from the Korean Air Force that are going to be up there. You can throw in the Dragons from the 25th, which are now, used to be at Suwon when I was there, but now are at Osan. Yeah. And they're going to be really, really busy, and of course survival is going to be key on their mind. Yeah. So there's a lot's going to happen, but you look what's happening right now between China and the rest of the Southeast Asian nations, including Vietnam. They're all claiming territory within Spratly Islands, and underneath that is a lot of oil, and China needs oil. They don't have a lot of oil within the Chinese mainland. They're going to try to get some from Afghanistan now. And, of course, they want to control the primary shipping lanes from the Straits of Malacca all the way up through the South China Sea, which, of course, feeds all the countries within the Southeast Asia area, excuse me. Then and Japan and Korea. Okay, 50% of world commerce goes through those straits every year. And if China blocks that gate, and right now I believe they have 8 islands that they have literally landed their own military presence on, and I think at least 3 of them have full-blown runways, operational runways now.
9,000 foot.
They're not doing that for no reason. So it's only a matter of time before that becomes a trigger.
I have gone on Google Earth, Mike, and saw flankers on Fiery Reef, one of the islands.
That's right.
Okay, and they've got the drive-through shelters all set up.
I've seen them.
There was one doing an engine run, and there was one being pulled into a place, and they caught it on a satellite on Google Earth, man.
Well,
and,
I can tell you right now, what's also in some of those reefs that they built, sub-pens.
Yes, I know that, and you can see those.
Again, China's going to claim those are theirs, and all the territory around there is theirs, and you have to pay to go through there. And that is going to, if that happens, that is going to be a massive impact to world economy and world stability. Nothing will get us to World War III faster than something like that. Forget about the fact that you've got Vladimir Putin looking to go shore up his gains now because everybody looked the other way during the Obama years when he came running into the Crimea, which is effectively Ukraine.
Yep.
Okay, whatever excuse you want to use, he wants to have access to the Mediterranean, and he's going to do it. And nothing stops him from deciding on whatever charge he wants to make, or whatever reason he considers is justifiable, to go maybe start moving into the rest of Ukraine, which is the breadbasket of that area.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of potential for powder kegs all the way across here. When you look at all of these, and you've already had the Philippines, Brunei, Japan, Korea, Taiwan,
Australia,
Vietnam, Australia. They're all Thailand. They've all said, hey, we will go to war to keep the South China Sea a free economic area. And China is literally pressing that test button right now. Yeah. And of course, Xi has made it very clear as to what he wants to do with Taiwan. And let's not forget, right after World War II, Communist China tried to invade and take over Taiwan at least twice. And just did not have the force and the technology to do that. That has changed somewhat now.
Yeah.
Now, I do have a lot of faith in the U.S. Navy.
Yeah.
U.S. Navy's got a lot of power in that area, and they can concentrate forces.
Yeah.
But China now has 3 aircraft carriers. We'll soon have 3 aircraft carriers. They've already got 2. But I suspect that those are really smaller carriers compared to our task force. But they've got air-to-surface missiles, and they've got surface-to-surface missiles that can track a carrier east. I could see this war propagating into one accusation after another, and then somebody coming up with a reason as to why it would be prudent to take over Taiwan, and they would much rather do it without firing a shot. So the best way to do that is get Americans to agree with them, and the best way to do that is to win the hearts and minds of the Americans from the inside. And that's where a lot of geopolitical and local, domestic political concerns become relevant. If you can get a socialist or a communist thinking government in the United States, then they can walk into Taiwan without firing a shot. Because Taiwan, in order to survive, would either fight to the death or they would have to give in. And I'm sure Chairman Xi is looking at those options right now. And this is all my opinion, I will admit. Yeah. But there's a lot in play there. Yeah. And having a weak, or at least the perception of a weak executive administration or legislative administration does not help us. Yep. And I believe that's where we are right now.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Lessons from the Cockpit with my boyhood friend Mike Reed, and learning how the F-22 was created and built and tested. And also learning that don't go out and lock up a Bear bomber if you don't want your radar busted. Both he and I lived in the Far East for a long period of time, and the geopolitics of what's going on over there is definitely going to affect the world when you have $2 to $3 trillion worth of commerce that goes through the South China Sea. And now the Chinese have these air bases spread throughout the South China Sea to stop that at any point in time that they want to. Thanks again to wallpilot.com for sponsoring this episode of Lessons from the Cockpit, where both of Mike's F4s that he flew at Osan and Clark can be found and bought for the walls of your home or office. On the next episode of Lessons from the Cockpit, I'm going to tell you about a sticky note on my desk and how that led to me building a team that created the most intense exercise ever in 18-wing history. If you've enjoyed this episode of Lessons from the Cockpit, please share it with your friends and loved ones, and by all means, subscribe. Have a great and safe week, folks, and we'll talk to you once again on Lessons from the Cockpit.